Wyoming Territory, September 1879. The wind was already sharp with the bite of coming snow when Margaret Zeller realized the wagon train had left her behind. She stood on the edge of the narrow trail, dust settling around her boots, her mouth dry. One wheel of the supply wagon had splintered crossing the creek bed, and when she had gone back for her satchel, when she had bent to grab the one thing she still had of her mother, they had kept going. No one had heard her yell. She looked up the trail. Empty. Not even a speck of movement on the ridgeline, just the sound of wind and the creak of leather on her shoulders. The satchel hung limp in her hand. Her chest burned. She was alone. Not 2 hours before, she had been wedged between the wagons, her skirts dusty, holding her chin high while the others whispered about her. Widowed before 20, they had muttered. No family, no place to go. She had ignored them. She always did. But now she was standing in the middle of nowhere, the sun dropping fast, and they had not even noticed she was gone. She turned, scanning the trail that twisted back toward the creek bend. Her eyes caught movement. A horse. A man. He was riding hard. Tan duster flapping behind him, hat pulled low. He came over the rise like he had been sent from somewhere better, somewhere that still remembered mercy. Margaret did not move. She could barely breathe. The rider reined in fast, kicking up dust, his boots hitting the ground before the horse had even stopped. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough from the ride. His eyes were sharp, scanning her over once for injury, then again softer, like he was seeing her proper now. Her voice caught. "They left me." "I know," he said simply. "Saw you were not with the wagons, rode back." She stared at him. "You noticed?" He nodded once. "Name's Elias O'Connell. I scout ahead sometimes, count heads more often than folks think." Margaret's lip trembled, and she hated that it did. She stiffened her spine. "I was getting my satchel. They just kept going." "Then they are fools," Elias said. "Come on." She hesitated. He stepped closer, hand out. "You got 2 choices, miss. Stand here and let the cold take you, or let me lift you up out of this dust and get you back safe." The hand stayed there, steady, clean nails, calloused palm, no hesitation. Margaret nodded once. Elias scooped her up like she weighed nothing, and his arms were warm, solid. He set her gently in the saddle before swinging up behind her. She tried not to lean back, but when the horse jolted into a trot, she could not help it. Her shoulder brushed his chest. He did not flinch. They rode in silence for a long stretch, the only sound the steady rhythm of hooves and wind through dried grass. He kept one hand careful at her waist, just enough to steady her. "You always look out for strays?" she asked finally. "I look out for people who need it," he said without pause. "And you looked like you needed it." Margaret swallowed hard. "I do not need saving." "I did not say you did," Elias said, "but you were left behind. That is not right. I am not the kind of man who lets that stand." She turned her head to look at him. His face was sun-browned, jaw tight, eyes the color of river stone. He met her gaze and did not look away. "Thank you," she said quietly. He tipped his head. They reached the wagon train by nightfall. The others barely noticed her return, save for a few who looked away, embarrassed. Elias helped her down gently, then handed her the satchel. "I already cleared a space near the fire," he said. "You should eat." "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. That night she sat near the flames, her skirts pulled tight around her legs, watching him. He sat a few feet away, sipping coffee from a battered tin cup, his hat low over his brow. He did not glance her way, not once. But when she shivered, he stood and draped his coat over her shoulders without a word. She looked up at him. "You planning to keep doing this?" He crouched beside her, eyes even with hers. "Doing what?" "Looking out for me." Elias's mouth twitched into the barest smile, not teasing, gentle. "Only if you let me," she blinked. For a long moment, neither of them moved, then she nodded just once. The next morning they rode side by side, not speaking much. There was something settling between them, quiet, warm. She caught him watching her hands once when she braided her hair quickly, fingers practiced and sure. He looked away when she noticed. "You got family waiting?" he asked that afternoon when they paused to water the horses. "No, you," he shook his head. "Lost my brother to cholera in Kansas, never married." Margaret chewed her lip. I married wrong, he was older, died of fever last winter. I have not missed him much. Elias nodded like he understood. The days passed. Each morning he waited until she was mounted up before riding off ahead. Each night he found her a safe spot near the fire. They did not talk about it, they did not need to. One evening, a storm rolled over the horizon fast and mean. The wagons huddled close beneath a rocky ledge. Margaret's hands were trembling from the cold as she tried to light a lantern. Elias appeared beside her, striking the match and cupping the flame. "You always this stubborn?" he asked. She gave him a look. "You always this helpful?" he grinned. Later that night, when the worst of the wind had passed, she stepped out of her tent and found him sitting alone on a rock watching the stars. She sat beside him. "You always sleep out here?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Feels closer to something good." She looked up at the sky. "I forgot how many stars there were." He looked at her, real direct. "You are not forgotten anymore." Margaret's breath caught. She turned her face toward him. This time he did not look away. He just reached out, slow and sure, and tucked a wind-blown strand of hair behind her ear. They sat like that, silent, until her hand found his on the rock between them. She did not pull away. Neither did he, and for the first time in a long while she did not feel alone. The trail turned harsher as they climbed into the foothills west of Fort Bridger. The aspens there had just begun to yellow, trembling like they knew the cold better than the people did. The wagons slowed over rock and rut. Elias kept to the edge, riding guard, though his eyes drifted toward Margaret more than they used to. She walked sometimes now, not because she had to, but because it steadied her. Elias didn't comment, just handed her water from his canteen when the sun rose high. She took it without a word, and that quiet exchange filled more space than most conversations. One afternoon, while they waited for a broken axle to be mended, Elias sat on a fallen log, whittling a sliver of pine. Margaret sat nearby, mending a tear in her overskirt. She watched his knife move with easy rhythm, each curl of wood falling like a breath. "What are you making?" she asked. "Don't rightly know yet," he said. "Sometimes it's just the shaping that helps." She gave a small nod. "I used to do that with cloth. Piece scraps together into something new even if I didn't need it. Gave my hands something to believe in when the rest of me couldn't." Elias looked up. "You sew for others now?" "Not yet. I've been thinking about it though. Folks always need mending. Maybe I could trade work for food or a roof." "You wouldn't have to trade much," he said, then hesitated. "Not if you had someone to stand beside." Margaret set her mending down slowly. "That sounds like more than a notion." "It is," he said. She didn't look away. "You don't know what you're asking." "Maybe not," he said, "but I know what I've seen. The way you keep going when most folks would have folded up, the way you don't ask for help but don't turn it away either, that's not common." She smoothed her skirt, fingers quiet. "I don't want someone to carry me. I've had that. It cost more than it gave." "I don't carry people," Elias said. "I ride beside them." The wind picked up. She squinted toward the far ridge where the sun lit the rocks in slices. "You ever think about stopping?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "But I never had a reason to." Margaret looked at him then, really looked. The way his shoulders held steady even when the world didn't. The way he spoke like the truth was something worth saying even if it cost. "I might be a slow thing," she said. "But I don't take steps I don't mean." "I've got time," Elias said. "I've got plenty of it." That evening they camped near a creek, and the sound of water smoothed the edges of the day. Margaret took off her boots and stood ankle-deep in the current, letting it numb her feet. Elias stayed back, watching from a flat boulder, arms crossed loosely. "You afraid of water?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. "No," he replied. "I just don't see the point in freezing my toes off when I can watch someone else do it." She grinned, teeth flashing. "It's not as cold as it looks. I'll take your word for it." She stepped out, shaking the droplets from her hem, and sat beside him on the sun-warmed stone. For the first time since she'd been left behind, there was no tension curled in her shoulders. She leaned back on her hands, eyes closed. "Where do you go after this?" she asked. I was headed toward Jackson Hole. Heard there's work up that way, fixing fence lines and hauling timber. You planning to ride alone?" He turned toward her. "Not if I can help it." Margaret's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. Her hand brushed his on the stone, not by accident this time. Elias didn't move, didn't press, just let the closeness settle. "I don't know what I want yet," she said, voice low, "but I know this being seen, being remembered, it matters." "I see you, Margaret," Elias said. "And I remember everything." She looked at him, long and sure, and something in her eased, not all the way, not yet. But the ground beneath her no longer felt like it would give way, and when they walked back to camp, she didn't walk alone. The trail crested a narrow ridge the next morning, the air thinner, touched with frost though the sun rode high. The wagons shifted slower now, burdened by distance and the strain of nearing winter. Margaret walked beside the lead oxen, her step even, her shawl tugged tight across her shoulders. Elias rode ahead, scouting the path down toward the basin where the wagons would rest that night. When he returned, his coat was dusted with pine needles, and his eyes held a weight she hadn't seen before. "There's a cabin," he said as he dismounted. "Abandoned but sound. Floors dry, chimneys whole, would be warmer than canvas tonight." "Who used to live there?" Margaret asked. "Hard to say. Place is empty but not ruined. Door was latched, not busted." She studied his face. "You think they're coming back? No sign of it. Stove's cold, no fresh tracks." "If they do, they'll find it still standing. That's more than most can hope for." She didn't answer, just nodded once. That night, as dusk folded over the camp and the wagons circled tight for windbreak, Elias waited by his horse as she packed her things. She didn't ask why he'd chosen her to ride with him. She just climbed up behind his saddle and wrapped her arms around his waist, her cheek resting against the back of his coat. The cabin stood in a hollow of spruce, its roof patched with old shingles, moss clinging to the north side. Inside, a layer of dust covered the windowsills, but the hearth was clean. Elias struck a fire while Margaret shook out the wool blankets she'd brought. Neither said much. They didn't need to. Later, with the fire throwing long shadows against the log walls, Margaret sat on a low bench and unwrapped a cloth bundle from her satchel. Inside were dried apples and a small tin of honey. She set them on the table without comment. "I used to keep these for winter," she said. "For when things got lean." Elias took a piece, chewing slowly. "You always plan ahead like that, when I can. There's comfort in knowing something sweet's waiting." He watched her fingers press the tin lid closed again. "You think about where you'll settle." "I think about where I won't," she said. "No towns too close to rail lines. No places where folks look too long at your ring finger before they look in your eyes." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You'd stay if it was right." "I'd stay if I was seen as more than what I lost," she said. "If I was wanted for who I am now, not who I used to be." Elias didn't flinch. "Then maybe the place don't matter as much as the person." She met his gaze. "And what if the person's been worn thin by dust and years?" "Then I'd say the weathering makes them strong in the right places." The fire snapped between them. Margaret reached for the kettle, poured hot water into the tin cups he'd brought in from the saddlebag. She passed him one, their fingers brushing. He didn't move his hand away. "You keep watch tonight?" she asked softly. "I will." She laid her palm over his. "Let me take first watch. You've done enough." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You trust me to sleep?" "I do," she said. "And I want you rested. If we ride on from here, I want both our eyes clear." He stood then, slow, and stepped toward the door. "Wake me when you're ready." "I will," she said. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, stirring the needles like breath. Margaret stood by the hearth a while longer, listening to the quiet. She didn't feel left behind anymore. She felt chosen. And that changed everything. The first snow came early, hushed and steady, softening the edges of the world outside the cabin. It clung to the branches and gathered in the hollows of the roof, muting the sound of the trees shifting in the wind. Inside, the fire held steady through the night, casting orange light across the rough floorboards. Elias stirred just before dawn, the scent of wood smoke and damp wool filling the small space. Margaret sat near the hearth, her knees drawn up beneath her shawl, eyes fixed on the fading coals. "You didn't wake me," he said, voice low from sleep. Her gaze lifted to his, calm and clear. "Didn't see the point. No trouble came." He sat up, brushing a hand through his hair. "Still, you shouldn't have sat up alone all night." "I wasn't alone," she said. "You were here." Elias held her stare for a beat, then reached for his boots without another word. When he stood, she handed him a tin of boiled oats she'd warmed over the fire. "You always cook without a sound?" he asked, taking it. "I've learned not to wake sleeping men unless I have to." He didn't answer that, just took a slow bite, then leaned against the wall near the door. Through the small window, the sky was turning pale, snow still drifting down like ash. "We can't stay long," he said after a while. "If it keeps falling like this, the pass'll be shut by week's end." She nodded but didn't rise. "I thought about that. I was thinking we might not head for Jackson after all." His head turned slightly. "You change your mind about settling?" "No," she said. "I just might have changed where I want to do it." Elias stepped away from the wall. "Say what you're thinking plain." Margaret set her cup aside. "There's a town east of here, fenced pastures, a schoolhouse near finished. I passed through it once before I lost my footing, seemed quiet but kind. They were building new roofs, not boarding up old ones." He considered it. "You'd feel safe there, I'd feel useful," she said. "They need hands who can stitch and mend. A woman who can teach letters, maybe, and they don't ask about what came before." Elias crouched by the hearth, poking at the coals. "I could find work there, fence work, hauling, maybe even run stock come spring." "You'd stay?" she asked. He didn't look up, just added another split log to the fire. "I didn't ride back for you just to ride off again." Margaret's throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. She stood and crossed the room, pulling a folded map from her satchel. She unrolled it on the table, flattening the corners with her palms. "I marked it here," she said, pointing to a narrow valley line. "They call it Laurel Creek." Elias leaned over her shoulder, his hand braced on the table beside hers. "That's a good stretch of land there. Plenty of runoff from the ridge. Plenty of space," she said quietly, "enough for two if they wanted it." His hand slid closer, the backs of their fingers brushing. "Do you?" She didn't move away. "I do." He turned his hand and laced his fingers through hers, slow and sure. "Then we'll go." They packed that morning with a kind of quiet purpose, folding what little they had into saddlebags. Elias checked the horse's hooves, scraping away ice with care. Margaret tied her bundle tight, then walked the perimeter of the cabin once before stepping into the saddle. They rode east through the thinning trees, snow drifting behind them in soft trails. No words passed between them for a long time, but the silence was full settled, steady. Near midday, Elias pointed to a break in the ridge ahead. "We'll make the valley before dark if we keep pace." Margaret nodded, her voice low. "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore." He looked at her, something steady in his gaze. "You don't have to be, not with me here." They rode on, the snow easing to a fine mist, the trees giving way to open land. And though the trail stretched ahead unknown and long, neither of them looked back. The dirt road into Laurel Creek curved between low hills, the valley spread wide and watchful beneath a pale sky. The snow had melted to patches by late afternoon, revealing dark soil and frost-bent grasses. Margaret sat tall in the saddle, her hands steady on the reins. Elias rode beside her, his coat open at the collar, hat low against the wind that moved in quiet eddies down from the ridge. They passed a split-rail fence under repair, a hammer left on a post. Farther up, a pair of oxen stood hitched near the edge of a new barn frame, the roof half slung with cedar shingles. A boy waved from the timberline. Elias lifted 2 fingers in return. Margaret's voice was soft but certain. "I remember that barn." They were still sawing beams last spring. "Looks like they've done well with it," Elias said. They dismounted outside a square house with whitewashed trim and a porch that sloped slightly on the left. The door opened before they could knock. A woman with a red kerchief tied behind her neck stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well now," she said, eyes flicking between the two of them. "You looking for work or a warm roof?" Both, Margaret answered, and a place to start honest. The woman stepped aside. Then you came to the right valley. I'm Ulmer Redding. My husband's at the mill, but I've got hot coffee and a list of things needing hands. Inside, the house smelled of ash soap and bread. Margaret didn't sit, not right away. She ran her fingers lightly over the back of a carved chair, then met Elias's eyes. I'll work for board, she said. So cook whatever's needed. You'll have your own key by week's end if you keep to that, Alma said, pouring coffee into tin cups. We're stretched thin since the teacher left. You can read. Well enough to teach letters, Margaret said, and numbers too. Then you're already twice what we had before. Elias stepped out to tend the horses while Margaret stayed behind, drawing a shallow basin of water to scrub her hands. When she joined him outside, the sun had dipped behind the ridge and the house behind them glowed soft in the half-light. You sure? Elias asked. I wouldn't have spoken if I wasn't, she said. He tied off the last strap, pulled his gloves on slow. Then I'll take work at the stables. There's fencing to fix and someone's been asking about a new well. We'll need a stove soon, she said, brushing hay from her skirt. If we mean to winter here, he nodded. I'll trade work for one. Or build it myself. They walked back toward the house together, not touching, but the distance between them was gone. The porch light flickered behind the window. Margaret paused at the steps. I'm staying here tonight, she said, but I'd rather not say good night yet. Elias's voice was quiet. Then don't. She turned to face him fully. I want this more than I thought I could again, but I'll not build it on promises that fade when the snow lifts. He stepped close enough for her to feel the heat of him through the cold. Margaret Zeller, I've crossed rivers and ridges behind you, and I'll cross 1,000 more if it means standing beside you come spring. I won't fade. She reached up, cupped his cheek with her gloved hand. It was the first time she'd touched him with intention, and he leaned into it without hesitation. I don't want a wedding dress, she said. I don't need one, he answered. I want a roof and a stove, a place that holds both our names. Then you'll have it. She tilted her face up, and his mouth met hers firm and slow, like the world had gone still to hold them in place. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. Tomorrow, she whispered. We start tomorrow. They did. By week's end, Margaret had taken over the low schoolhouse at the edge of town, her handwriting on the slate board and her voice calling out lessons to children who no longer stared at her with suspicion. Elias worked dawn to dusk, his shoulders sunburned and hands split but steady. He came home with bent nails in his pocket and pine sap in the seams of his shirt, and he always stopped by the schoolhouse before supper. They married in the early spring, not in a church, but under a cottonwood near the edge of the creek. Margaret wore a plain blue dress, and Elias shaved for the first time in months. Ulmer Redding brought bread and a jar of wild honey. The schoolchildren scattered flowers in the grass. They moved into a one-room cabin Elias had raised with his own hands, tight-framed and windproof, with a stove twice the size of what they'd hoped for. Margaret hung a calico curtain across the back to give the bed its own corner. Elias built a bench beneath the window where she liked to read in the low light of evening. In the quiet hours between chores, they sat near the fire, hands twined, the silence between them full and sure. There was no need for grand declarations. They had chosen each other when there was nothing but road ahead, and that had been enough. Years passed gently. Margaret taught through the seasons, her students growing up and coming back to visit with babies on their hips. Elias built homes for new settlers, mended fences, and never once strayed from her side. They grew older, not quieter. They argued over how to stack kindling and how much salt belonged in stew, but they laughed more than they didn't. And every night, Elias kissed her hand before they banked the fire. One spring, she planted lilacs by the front step. He built a swing from the cottonwood where they'd wed. When they sat side by side on it in the evenings, they didn't speak of what they'd lost, only of what they'd made. And it was enough. It was everything,